Hello, this is the lecture on processes of emotion in the workplace. So the first chunk talks about sort of different dichotomies and ideas in theory around emotion in the workplace. And so the introduction talks about how emotion in the sort of original, traditional, mechanistic workplace is highly minimized and mostly taboo. And then the idea of bounded rationality came in, which accepted the idea that there are limits to how rational we can be because humans are not rational all the time, or maybe even most of the time. And then that was sort of turned on its head with the idea of bounded emotionality, which is that we are constantly emotional creatures, but that we must curtail that in some ways to be able to function together at work. And I would stretch that to in your family and society. We find ways of bounding our emotionality in social situations, certainly in social situations that are not based on deep, intimate relationships. The next concept that I thought was interesting was the idea of surface or deep acting. So the idea that we all have a certain amount of emotion we are expected to portray, whether it is rationality, which isn't really an emotion but kind of is, or calmness or compassion or excitement. And the question is, do we do the like that Office Space character who's like, how can I help you? With the squeaky voice, who the main character is really annoyed by. Is it this surface level, just modulating your pitch and gluing a smile to your face, like the sort of Miss America smile? Or is it something we reach deeper in ourselves for? And so a question that comes up for me around that is, where is the line between emotion and energy? Because it takes energy to do any kind of work, including the work that involves interacting with other people. And so I'm not sure when something is not acting. So that's a little unclear to me. So the next concept, emotional labor, which is again the more surface level, I'm expected to behave enthusiastically in any kind of customer-facing environment. Certainly there is an aspect of emotional labor, but the concept of emotional work is a little bit trickier because it is the idea of, I think, all of the emotions that we have to call upon in order to adapt to our environment. So certainly, as we've been talking a great deal about culture, the emotions that we are expected to display inside of our work culture, whether or not we feel them, is emotional work, or perhaps even emotional labor if they are dissonant. So if I have to, pretend enthusiasm over a cool new slogan when I really don't think it's all that awesome, or am just not that pumped about it, that I would call emotional labor. Whereas the kind of energy and enthusiasm and interest I have to maintain to teach is more emotional work. So that's how it looks in my life. And so I would sort of look at emotional work as being the more authentic kind of emotion, and emotional labor as perhaps being the more inauthentic types of emotion. Both of them are work, though, and both of them take energy. And that's something that would be interesting to think about. So again, I feel like the surface or deep acting, emotional labor, and emotional work, both of those concepts kind of go together. And I think what might fit in with them is the idea of authenticity or dissonance. So am I experiencing cognitive dissonance, which is draining of energy and can lead to burnout, which we'll talk about next? Or do I feel authentic, which might be tiring, but not draining, dispiriting, depressing, or anxiety creating? So When I read this, I'm thinking a lot about the correlation between emotion and energy. And then the next section talks about bullying. There's a Spotlight on Scholarship article about bullying and some statistics about 90% of adults in their work life have experienced bullying. So that's an interesting report, because if 90% of people experience bullying, does that mean only 10% of people are bullies, which I don't even like as a word because it's not supposed to be a noun. So that's always interesting to me. I've read a great deal of literature on workplace bullying, and some of the literature is not very well validated. There's an association that's doing research on bullying, and bullying is certainly a problem because, as we spoke about in class, it's not prosecutable. So there are very few protections for bullied people. And I think often if someone is acting out in the workplace in a way that's frightening and that violates the norms or the culture or is taboo, people often cope by just ignoring it and hoping it'll go away because there's no language with which to approach it. If you're not allowed to say, I'm scared, then you can't say to the person who's hounding you or talking crap about you that they're frightening you, because the fear is absolutely a taboo emotion in most corporate workplaces in the United States. And so I'm not minimizing that bullying happens, but what I do think is that the research rarely looks into or tries to get its arms around who is bullying and what is that? Are they just horrible bad people and they're 10 of the 100%, that 90 of which are the bullied? No, not so much. Certainly in school research, bullying and being bullied and being a bystander are all roles that children play. And I think it carries right on through into the workplace. So you need to look, I think, at some of the underlying causes of bullying, which for me go back to fear, go back to survival mechanisms, and the idea that our sense of competency, our fear of whether or not we are respected, which all comes down to survival fears and fight or flight. People who have lower impulse control, which can be all of us depending on the amount of stress we're under, may revert to behaviors that can be described as bullying. And so when we talk about workplace bullying, it's important not just to say who are the bullies, but in what ways do I act out difficult emotions in the workplace that might be destructive to other people, and how can I think about finding new ways of dealing with those feelings, or perhaps working towards changing, especially if you're in a managerial position, norms around how you discuss taboo emotions in the workplace. And so, even in the school environment, some emotions are easier to talk about, others are not. It totally depends on what discipline you're studying. That's something I'm particularly interested in right now. And I think the section on bullying leaves out the other 90% of it, which is which roles do we play when and why? Because as children are always the bullies, the bullied, and the bystanders, I think as adults we are too. And we have to get sort of past the pain of realizing that sometimes we behave in ways that are unproductive or hurtful towards other people, and get at the underlying cause. Why is that the path of least resistance? And that may help us learn to deal with people who are aggressive in the workplace. Some people, you're not going to get through to them. They don't have the language. But I think in many cases, aggressive behavior in the workplace is the result of fear. And if we can recognize our own fear and stress in the workplace and how it drives us to behave in ways that might be less than healthy sometimes, we may be able to create space for more conversation. So my 2 cents about bullying, because it's a much more complex issue. And right now our culture is very, bullies are bad, let's lock up all the bullies and throw away the key. Well, the reality is everyone acts aggressively and hurts other people's feelings sometimes. It's a matter of degree. So if criminal amounts of bullying are going on, bystanders are doing nothing, and someone is being made to feel unsafe, depressed, miserable, and they've attempted to go through some kind of mediation, which has happened, and I've seen it in workplaces where I've been a consultant or a teacher, that is a serious issue, and there needs to be more legislation so that there is recourse for people who are being abused. But I do think that bullying is sometimes abuse and sometimes doesn't reach that level. And at that point, there is some mutual responsibility for learning how to have discussions around the emotions that cause people to behave in ways that can be overly aggressive or damaging. So anyway, question that comes up for me around that is hazing bullying. There was a case in the book about teaching firefighters how you acclimate them to a culture in which they're put at risk a lot. And I don't know if firefighters have any kind of hazing rituals, but I know that the military does. I know that there's a whole ritual for new naval people who are in the Navy, soldiers. The first time they cross the equator, they go through this like couple-day, fairly violent hazing ritual. And, you know, that's always sounded kind of barbaric and crazy to me, but at the same time, if you are in an environment where you are expected to trust and have some kind of deep emotional bond that allows you to rely on other people to save each other's lives, I'm not saying that that ritual is a good ritual or not, but again, we have to look at military training for special forces involves putting somebody under an enormous amount of stress so that they are not afraid of what might happen when they're captured, so that they can then face it more rationally, so they face their fears. So it's kind of like, there's a term in psychology called flooding, which means overwhelming the person with what they're scared of so that they can get past their fear of it. It's generally considered pretty barbaric, but when you are in an environment that is high risk, and you're going to be in situations that are terrifying and you have to not freeze up or run away, is hazing, or what we consider hazing, more acceptable? You know, I don't think hazing in colleges, in fraternities and sororities is acceptable. I think it's idiotic. But the kind of socially created rituals that happen in high stress environments may have positive outcomes. I think they can get out of control, but again, where is the line between acting out bullying and abuse? And I think that has to be determined by the people within the situation. And then there has to be some recognizable rules and laws around it. So I have a lot to say about bullying. Okay, yeah, you're welcome for that title. If you're not watching this and just listening to it, you won't know what I'm talking about. But if you are, enjoy that earworm. So the book talks about emotional intelligence really briefly. This is a theory that is espoused by a scientist named Daniel Goleman, who's become very popular management literature guy, which then makes him automatically suspect for everybody in academia, because as soon as you get any kind of beyond academia claim, everybody thinks that you're pop literature and not valid anymore, and that's a whole other ball of wax. So anyway, obviously this author doesn't give it a lot of credence, and she neglects to point out that it's not just about learning to control the emotions of others, which is basically how she summarizes it. Emotional intelligence is about being able to recognize and name your emotions as you're having them. So if I am feeling fearful and I'm having anxiety in the workplace, which is an environment or a culture that may not allow for any kind of expression or acknowledgement of that feeling, I may repress it and act out in some other way, like being a jerk, or taking a really long lunch, or getting really sleepy, or eating too many cookies. There's all sorts of ways that I will act out on that emotion if I'm not conscious that I'm having anxiety and fear. But if I can say, oh, I'm having an anxiety and fear right now, what's the best way for me to calm my body down? What are the symptoms that my body is having in this moment? And emotional intelligence is a lot about strengthening the mind-body connection. And I know one of the theorists in this field, so I'm a little grouchy that she's left out so much of this. If you can strengthen that communication line of communication between your body and your mind, you then have an array of choices in front of you other than acting out, other than snapping at the next person who stops by your office, or eating an extra bag of M&Ms, or whatever it is you do to soothe your stress. So if I go, wow, my stomach's feeling kind of uncomfortable, or my chest is feeling kind of tight. Oh gosh, that means I'm having anxiety, probably around this thing that's due, but it doesn't really matter because I can't fix it right now. So I'm going to have a cup of green tea and go for a walk, or I'm going to meditate for a few minutes, or just breathe deeply, or turn off my computer, but do something to calm my whole limbic system rather than just avoid it through some other kind of behavior. So it's deep psychological stuff. And so the idea of emotional intelligence in the workplace is for employees, leaders to be able to recognize all of their emotions, not just the acceptable ones, be able to soothe and deal with their emotions, and then be able to communicate clearly with other people and make good decisions, not necessarily rational decisions, but conscious decisions after they have gone through whatever is going on in their bodies and emotions. So she's a little quick to write it off. Yes, it has been pitched as another, panacea for the workplace because that sells books, but it's not something to write off. You'll probably come across it again, and if psychology in the workplace is of interest to you and emotion in the workplace is of interest to you, the best place to find Daniel Goleman's stuff in bite-sized form is the Harvard Business Review. He writes articles there a lot. Some professors consider it a peer-reviewed journal, some don't. I would consider it a peer-reviewed journal, even though it's probably not technically peer-reviewed, but it's really good stuff written by, PhDs and highly respected. But anyway, if you look him up, you can find a million articles on the workplace. And if you look him up in the Wall Street Journal, Daniel Goleman, and you'll never have to read one of his big bestseller books because it's all in the articles. So if you're interested in that, check him out. The next section is on burnout. So, obviously we can get burned out in our work, burned out in our lives. If you have an aging, ailing parent and a high stress work life, adding one more wrinkle into that can kind of push you over the edge. The book talks about workload, role conflict, and role ambiguity as being the three main stressors in the workplace. I think that that's kind of bogus because I think what really happens is what I described is that we get overbalanced. Like one of those things might be the primary thing that's stressing us out, but often it's something outside, like, starting college. That can certainly up your stress level and your perception of not having enough time. So what I thought would be interesting to think about is how those three aspects might be heightened or created by school. So workload is pretty obvious. Every semester your workload is going to be different. It's going to depend on your teachers. It's going to depend on how many classes you take. So learning to expect the unexpected is really a big part of managing your workload in school. It only took me about a semester in graduate school the last time, but this time it's taken me about a year and a half because my workload was very steady in the MSOL program and is incredibly erratic in my PhD program. So I can't plan for my workload. All I can do is take my best guess at how much it's going to be, arrange my life accordingly, and be willing to adjust if things get to be too heavy, rather than go, push on through, what's wrong with you, which might be my first inclination. Not anymore. So role conflict, having too many different things that you are supposed to be doing at one time. Requirements that clash with each other. So maybe you're supposed to be a project manager and you're pushing things through, but You're also kind of the emotional support for your team. It's pretty hard to play both of those roles at once, I promise. In school, you might be someone that your peers go to for editing help, but you're just trying to like make it through the day. So there's some role conflict. Like you want to help and you want to be part of the culture and have relationships with other people who are in the same boat as you. Or perhaps you've just taken too many classes and there's conflict between what one professor expects and when and what another professor expects and when, because that never happens. And then role ambiguity. At work, we certainly know what it's like to get thrown in the deep end and not have any idea where to find the staplers and who to talk to about this and who you're supposed to call in IT. In school, certainly, it's this iterative process. Every semester, we get a little more acclimated to the school and to some of the basic cultural expectations and technical expectations in the school. But the role you play in the class socially is going to change depending on what the makeup of the class is, which semester. And also, your teacher's expectations are going to be different every semester. So maybe think about how you can manage your stress and avoid burnout when you're in school. Those of you who this is your first semester, hang on to your chairs because that's pretty much just how you get through the first semester. You will learn from your mistakes. You will learn from when you get overloaded and when there's too much conflict. But also I think it's really good to have resources amongst the students. So, reach out to the students who've been in the program for a while, who've already been through the first semester difficulties. Or if you're headed towards capstone and that's freaking you out, talk to the students who were at the end of capstone. So one other criticism I have of the book, I was a little disappointed by this chapter. It takes a very cognitive behavioral approach to emotion in the workplace, which is just like, we have emotions and then we manage them. We have stress and then we manage it. Here's what burnout looks like, and here's how we can fix it. It's very surface level. So Morgan, who the author refers to a lot in the first 3 or 4 chapters on cognitive frameworks, his whole chapter on emotion in the workplace is about psychology and about how we often react to people in the workplace based on our family schema. So if I am used to authority figures who are lackadaisical and loose and easy, and I have a boss who's like that, then I may react to them the way I react to my parents or to one of my parents. If I have very militaristic, strict parents, then I may be attracted to workplaces that have less ambiguity, but I may also have authority issues come up. So basically the idea that you can leave your issues and your history at the door at work is fairly bogus from the psychological standpoint. And the author doesn't really go into that much. She doesn't really talk about anything other than, bullying, burnout, and stress. So I have lots of articles and information on the psychological and psychodynamic perspectives in the workplace. And those of you who are psychology majors, the stuff that you're learning about families and social groups applies at work just as much. So when we think about that bounded emotionality, that's the same as it is in our families. How we bound our emotionality in our families is different than how we bound it in our workplace, but we do not change from one person to the other when we go to work. We may feel like it, we may feel like we're putting on a different mask, but we take our history, our strengths, our weaknesses, and all of our issues with us into the workplace. And so my feeling about that is know thyself. That's why emotional intelligence to me starts to get at it, where knowing your feelings, knowing your history, recognizing when you are having a reaction that is more intense than the situation may necessarily call for, is it time for you to go, okay, time out me. Why is this making me so upset? When has this come up for me in the past? How can I take care of myself until I've calmed down enough that I can go deal with this problem in a little bit more level way? Not necessarily a fully rational way, but a more integrated way. So I'll have lots more to say about this chapter in class, but that's a little sneak preview. And that is the end of the lectures for this week.